I got called out by my present day self for some of the writing opinions that my past day self had. That's right, as time has gone on and I've gotten older and balder and potentially wiser, some of my thoughts on writing have changed. Dear God, I'm a flip flopper. I've allowed new experiences and information not previously available to me to shape a more thoroughly positioned stance on certain issues when it comes to writing. Most of these changes, in my opinions, are actually somewhat minor and nuanced, but they have changed how I think about some aspects of the writing process, and in the interest of transparency, I'm going to share some of them with you today. Alright, the first opinion of mine that has shifted is around new writers starting with short stories or other short fiction rather than just jumping into a novel. I used to very strongly recommend that if your goal ultimately is to write a novel, that you should start practicing writing a novel fairly early on. This is in contrast to a very common piece of advice that tells new writers to start with short stories before moving into novels. I used to push back on this advice because I think novel writing and short story writing do overlap, but they are distinct mediums, and practice in one is not the optimal way to build skills in the other. A lot of people who write short fiction kind of get a little bit testy when people mention starting with short fiction instead of novels, because the advice kind of implies that short stories are easier than novels, which is not necessarily true. A lot of people give this advice partly because of some conflation of other advice that they're hearing. A lot of older best-selling authors tell people to start with short stories before moving on to novels. But often what they mean is that you should try to get short stories published before you try to get a novel published. Not necessarily that writing short stories is a good way to build skills to start writing novels. In the past, one of the ways to get a book deal was to get several short stories published in different literary magazines. This gives you some publishing credits that you could highlight when querying an agent for a novel deal. When a lot of older authors especially talk about starting with short stories, this is what they mean. It's a way to break into the publishing space, not necessarily something you should start with because it's the best way to build up your skills. Setting that whole publishing idea aside, does starting with short fiction make sense if your long-term ambition is to write a novel, purely from a skills perspective? Specificity is really important. A novel is a completely different beast than a short story. The more practice you have with novels, the better you will get at writing novels. These are different areas of competency. A short story is not easier or harder than a novel. It's different. Overall, it's less work to produce a short story just because of the length. But I think categorically saying that for a beginner, short stories are easier to master is incorrect. All that being said, my opinion has shifted to recommending that people start with shorter fiction. Not because it's an easier medium to master, but because of the other skills that you'll learn while finishing shorter pieces of fiction. The cadence of short fiction, the fact that you can finish so many more of them in a shorter period of time, will pay dividends for a new writer. I think getting from the beginning to the end of a story is a really good learning process, and short fiction allows you to do that at a much more rapid pace. A lot of those skills will carry over to writing longer work like a novel if that's what you want to do. And I would even go as far as to saying that if you're a beginner, starting with something like a novella or a novelette is probably a better idea than jumping into a novel. I get comments sometimes from people with like 150 or 250,000 word projects, and I don't know what experience level these folks are at, but pulling off an engaging plot with enough depth to stretch to that length is really, really hard. Until you have a good base of working with plot, it's really hard to pull off a novel that's that long. And if it's your first novel, that's even tougher. I think part of why people end up writing these gargantuan novels is they don't have that basis of storytelling and understanding beginning, middle, and end. And so they just end up wandering around in the story for pages and pages, and it doesn't really get anywhere. Starting with shorter fiction, because it allows you to write more beginnings and endings, will set you up for that in a better way. There's still a lot to learn, but starting small is good advice. Advice that I've come to appreciate more and more as time has gone on. Next opinion of mine that has changed somewhat, and people probably won't like this, but it's that you don't need to write first thing in the morning. I used to say that you could write first thing in your day or last thing in your day, and it was kind of a matter of preference, and one wasn't necessarily better than the other. I am leaning more and more towards writing early in your day as being better. I'm one of those freaks who gets up early in the morning. Like the first number on the clock is a 4. I do this primarily to inflate my ego because it's something that really doesn't require that much effort, but it sounds really impressive when you talk about it on the internet. I'm better than you because I'm awake when a specific arbitrary number on a clock is showing. I'm an incredible specimen of optimized humanity. Please bask in my superiority. When I write, it's usually the first thing I do in the morning. And in my view, if you want to get the best out of your writing, that's when you should write too. Now, I want to be clear, it's not about getting up early to write. It's about writing being one of the first things that you do in your day. Whether you get up at noon or 5 a.m. or 5 p.m., it doesn't matter. It's not the time of day, it's the order that you do things in your day. And if you want to get the most out of your writing, if you want to get the best you can out of your practice, writing should be something that happens early in your day, regardless of what time your day starts at. I used to think that this was more of a personal preference, that for some people writing later in the day was better. That could still be true, but I'm leaning more and more towards the idea that writing is best done when your mental gas tank is full, and that means writing before you do other cognitively intensive tasks. Doing something challenging like writing is harder to do when you're drained at the end of the day. I think for best results, I feel very strongly that you should try to write as near to the first thing as you can. I recognize that a lot of people with your work and family and school schedule and stuff, that you're not going to be able to do that. And that's totally fine if it doesn't work within your schedule. This is not something you have to do. It's just the ideal way to do it if your schedule and life situation allows you to do that. Next opinion of mine that has changed has to do with purpose and the purpose that everything in your novel should have. I'm a big proponent of everything that you write serving a purpose. If I pull out a scene or a line of dialogue or a paragraph of description from your manuscript, you should be able to tell me why it's there and what it's doing to further the interests of your story. There should be nothing that is just fluff. Flash fiction writers and short story writers kind of live this moment to moment just because their mediums are so much tighter that being concise is something that they have to do. A short story is like an airship or a blimp. The capacity is low enough that you need to consider everything that you're putting into it. A novel, by comparison, tends to feel more like a cargo ship. You have a lot more space and you can almost fit anything into it, but that doesn't mean that a half-empty novel is a good thing. A novel is about telling an 80,000 word story, not stretching out a 50,000 word story. You should feel like you still don't have a ton of room to waste. You should feel the same way that a short story or flash fiction writer feels about the length of their medium. You should feel like it's a struggle to get everything into your novel. There's nuance here. You can definitely cram too much into a novel and have it move way too fast and just be a mess with pacing and everything. So it's about fitting the right amount in, making sure that you have enough, but not too much and not too little. I still 100% believe this, that there isn't room for fluff in a novel and you need to tell the right length story. but I've expanded what I consider to be not waste a little bit more. Or maybe said a better way, I've refined my view on the purpose of a story. Your story ultimately needs to create a feeling in the reader, a series of feelings from beginning through the middle to the end, some kind of emotional response. Anything that furthers that aim, anything that enhances the emotional response, has a place in the story. In the past, I would have limited this to say everything must advance the plot or add characterization or exposit your setting. And yeah, most of your novel or most of your story should do those things. But you also may need some elements in there that only serve to manage the emotional reactions of the reader. To an uncritical eye, this might seem like fluff, but for a really skilled writer, it is important. When Tolkien has the hobbits sit down and smoke and eat rice cakes and sing a song that goes on for 15 pages, yeah, that doesn't really do a ton for the plot. It maybe does a little bit for characterization, but the main impact of that sort of scene is about creating a feeling in the reader. It's about handling that emotional response. That still has a place. That's still valid. That's not fluff. That's not waste because it's serving the ultimate purpose of the story. Amateur writers talk a lot about plot and setting. Pro writers talk about emotional engagement and pulling the reader through the story, getting them hooked emotionally. Doing that in an effective way sometimes means putting in what looks like fluff but actually has a purpose. You can break literally every rule in writing provided it creates a better reader experience. I'm realizing more and more just how many rules you should be willing to break in pursuit of that end. Anyway, speaking of pursuit of an end, we're at the ending of this video. So there you have it. I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Possibly with some more inconsistent opinions.